Sarah Martinez had spent 8 years in the Navy SEALs, surviving missions that would break most people. She'd faced enemy fire, navigated through minefields, and saved countless lives. But nothing prepared her for the moment when her own neighbors would dismiss her warnings as paranoid rambling from a crazy ex-military woman. When she noticed the strange patterns around her quiet suburban neighborhood, the same unmarked vans, the men who didn't belong, the unusual activity at odd hours, her military instincts screamed danger. She tried to warn them. She begged them to listen. They laughed. They called her paranoid. They whispered about PTSD. They rolled their eyes when she suggested calling the police. Sarah's lost it, they said. Military service messed with her head. But when the first house exploded at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, everything changed. When the screaming started and chaos erupted in their peaceful street, suddenly everyone remembered Sarah Martinez wasn't just their quirky neighbor with the perfectly maintained lawn. She was a trained killer, a protector, a guardian who had sworn an oath that didn't end when she left the service. In the next 72 hours, Sarah would prove that some warnings shouldn't be ignored, some instincts shouldn't be questioned, and some people never stop being warriors, even when they're wearing civilian clothes. This is the story of how one woman's military training saved an entire neighborhood from a terror plot that could have killed hundreds, and why nobody ever doubted Sarah Martinez again. Sarah Martinez knelt in her front garden, carefully tending to her roses, when she first noticed something was wrong. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street, and most of her neighbors were already at work or dropping kids at school. It was the perfect time for surveillance, which is exactly why the unmarked white van parked 3 houses down caught her attention. She had been living in this quiet suburban neighborhood for 2 years now, ever since her medical discharge from the Navy SEALs following a training accident that shattered her left ankle. The doctors said she'd never run properly again, let alone complete the grueling physical demands of special operations. They were probably right, but Sarah had adapted. She always adapted. The van had been there for 3 days now, always in different spots but never more than 2 blocks away. Different license plates each time, but the same model, same color, same tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. To most people it would be invisible, just another service vehicle in a neighborhood where contractors and delivery trucks came and going constantly. But Sarah's trained eye caught patterns others missed. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, and walked casually toward her mailbox. As she pretended to check for letters, she memorized details. Virginia plates this time, a small dent on the rear bumper, fresh tire treads, professional-grade window tinting, not the cheap stuff teenagers used. The engine was running, barely audible but creating a slight heat shimmer she could detect. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Sarah turned to find Mrs. Henderson from next door walking her ancient golden retriever, Buster. The 73-year-old retired teacher had been Sarah's first friend in the neighborhood, the only one who didn't seem bothered by having an ex-military woman living next door. Very peaceful, Sarah replied, though her eyes tracked movement in her peripheral vision. Someone had shifted inside the van. Mrs. Henderson, have you noticed any new contractors working in the neighborhood lately? The older woman paused, following Sarah's gaze toward the van. Can't say I have, dear. Why do you ask? Just curious. That van's been around for a few days. Thought maybe someone was having work done. Mrs. Henderson shrugged. Could be the Johnsons. They mentioned something about getting their driveway redone. She tugged gently on Buster's leash as the dog tried to investigate an interesting smell. You know how these contractor types are. Sometimes they scout locations for days before starting work. Sarah nodded, but every instinct screamed that this wasn't about home improvement. The positioning was wrong. The timing was wrong. Everything felt wrong. That evening, she decided to do some reconnaissance of her own. After dark, she slipped out through her back door, dressed in black athletic wear, her face darkened with charcoal. Old habits died hard, and her ankle might be damaged, but she could still move silently when needed. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the usual sounds of suburban life filtering through windows. Television shows, late dinners, children being put to bed. Normal, peaceful sounds that made what she was investigating feel even more sinister. Sarah worked her way through backyards, staying in shadows, using trees and fences for cover. Her military training had taught her to observe without being observed, to gather intelligence without leaving traces. Despite her injury, muscle memory guided her movements. The van was parked on Elm Street this time, 2 blocks over. As she approached from behind, staying low and using parked cars for concealment, she could hear voices inside. Male voices speaking in low tones, but she was too far away to make out words. She belly crawled under a nearby SUV, ignoring the pain shooting through her ankle, and strained to listen. The conversation was in English, but heavily accented. Middle Eastern, possibly Syrian or Lebanese, though she couldn't be certain. What she could make out chilled her to the bone. This is the book. It's about history. Tuesday morning just before dawn, maximum casualties during shift change, secondary devices in case the first. Sarah's blood ran cold. These weren't contractors or lost tourists. These were people planning something horrible, and Tuesday was only 4 days away. She needed more information, but getting closer risked exposure. Instead, she memorized every detail she could observe from her position. The license plate was different again. This time, Maryland. There were at least 3 people inside, possibly 4. The van sat low on its springs, suggesting it was carrying significant weight. After 20 minutes, the conversation stopped, and the engine started. Sarah remained motionless under the SUV as the van pulled away, its headlights sweeping across the street. She waited another 10 minutes before emerging, her mind already working through the implications of what she'd heard. Back home, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to piece together what she knew. The fragments of conversation suggested a planned attack, something involving timing around a shift change, with backup plans for maximum damage. Tuesday morning could mean anything: a workplace, a school, a government building. But the fact that they were surveilling her neighborhood suggested the target was local. She picked up her phone to call 911 and then hesitated. What could she tell them? That she'd overheard fragments of a conversation while conducting illegal surveillance? That she suspected a van of being involved in terrorist activity based on limited evidence? Without more concrete proof, she'd sound like a paranoid veteran seeing threats where none existed. Sarah had encountered this problem before, in her first year after leaving the service. Well-meaning friends and family had suggested therapy, medication, anything to help her adjust to civilian life. They meant well, but they didn't understand that some skills, once learned, couldn't be unlearned. Some instincts, once honed, remained sharp forever. The next morning, she tried a different approach. She called the local police non-emergency line and spoke to an officer named Detective Rodriguez. "I'd like to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood," she began. "What kind of suspicious activity, ma'am?" "There's been an unmarked van conducting surveillance of residential areas for the past 4 days. Different license plates, always positioned for optimal observation points. Occupants engaging in counter-surveillance behavior." There was a pause. "Ma'am, are you saying you believe you're under surveillance?" "Not me specifically, the neighborhood in general. I have military experience, and this fits patterns associated with pre-operational intelligence gathering." Another pause. Longer this time. "Ma'am, what's your name and address?" Sarah provided the information, already sensing where this conversation was heading. "Ms. Martinez, I see here you've called us twice in the past year about suspicious activity that turned out to be legitimate business operations. Once about a photography team you thought was conducting reconnaissance, and another time about utility workers you believed were mapping infrastructure." Sarah closed her eyes. Both incidents had been embarrassing false alarms, situations where her military paranoia had gotten the better of her judgment. The photography team had been shooting a wedding at the church down the street. The utility workers had been updating gas line maps after a small leak 2 blocks away. "Detective, I understand my previous reports were incorrect, but this situation is different. I have reason to believe there may be a planned attack in the local area, possibly scheduled for Tuesday morning." "Ma'am, based on what evidence?" Sarah hesitated. She couldn't explain about her nighttime reconnaissance without admitting to illegal activity. Behavioral patterns, conversation fragments, tactical positioning. "Have you been taking your medication, Miss Prossi? And Martinez?" The question hit her like a physical blow. 6 months ago, during a particularly difficult period of adjustment, her doctor had prescribed anxiety medication to help with what he'd termed hypervigilance related to PTSD. She'd taken the pills for exactly 3 weeks before deciding she'd rather deal with her demons on her own terms. I'm not having a mental health episode, Detective Rodriguez. I'm reporting legitimate suspicious activity. I understand your concerns, ma'am, and I want you to know we take all reports seriously. I'll make sure patrol units keep an eye on your neighborhood over the next few days. But in the meantime, might I suggest you speak with someone about these feelings of being watched or threatened? Sometimes the adjustment to civilian life can be challenging for our veterans. Sarah hung up the phone without another word. She'd been dismissed, categorized, filed away as another damaged soldier, seeing enemies where none existed. The fact that she'd been wrong before didn't help her credibility, and the detective's suggestion about medication made it clear how her report would be handled. But she knew what she'd heard. She knew what she'd seen, and she had less than 3 days to figure out how to stop whatever was coming. That afternoon, she decided to approach her neighbors directly. If the authorities wouldn't listen, maybe the potential victims would. She started with Tom Chen, the software engineer who lived across the street. Tom was logical, methodical, the kind of person who might appreciate a systematic analysis of threats. "Sarah, hey." Tom greeted her when she knocked on his door. His 6-year-old daughter Emma was visible in the background, playing with blocks in the living room. "Tom, I need to talk to you about something important. Can we speak privately?" He stepped onto his front porch, closing the door behind him. "What's on your mind?" "There's been suspicious activity in the neighborhood, but I have reason to believe there may be a security threat, possibly as early as Tuesday morning. I think you and your family should consider staying somewhere else for a few days." Tom's expression shifted from polite attention to concern, but not the kind Sarah had hoped for. "What kind of threat?" "I've observed surveillance activity consistent with pre-operational intelligence gathering. Unmarked vehicles, unusual patterns of behavior. Conversation fragments suggesting coordinated planning." "Conversation fragments? Sarah, have you been monitoring people?" The question caught her off guard. "I've been observing suspicious activity in our shared neighborhood, yes." Tom ran a hand through his hair, glancing back at his house where his daughter played innocently. "Look, Sarah, I know you have a military background, and I respect your service, but this sounds... are you sure you're not reading too much into normal activity?" "Tom, I spent 8 years in special operations. I know the difference between normal activity and threat assessment. But you also thought the cable company was mapping our homes for some kind of infiltration last month." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. The cable company incident had been another embarrassing mistake, triggered when she'd noticed technicians photographing houses in a pattern she'd interpreted as tactical reconnaissance. It turned out they were updating their service maps after a major infrastructure upgrade. "This is different. Sarah, I appreciate your concern, I really do. But Emma has school Tuesday, I have a major presentation at work, and honestly, moving my family based on suspicions, it's not really practical." She tried 3 more houses that evening with similar results. The Hendersons were polite but dismissive. The young couple in the blue house listened patiently before explaining they couldn't take time off work for unspecified threats. The family with teenagers actually laughed, the father making a joke about G.I. Jane seeing terrorists behind every tree. By Sunday evening, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen, feeling completely isolated. Every rational part of her mind acknowledged the possibility that she was wrong again, that her damaged psyche was manufacturing threats to justify the hypervigilance she couldn't seem to turn off. But her gut, trained through years of life-and-death situations, insisted something terrible was coming. She spent the night cleaning her service pistol, checking her emergency supplies, and planning response scenarios. If she was wrong, she'd endure more embarrassment and probably end up in mandatory counseling. If she was right, her neighbor's dismissal might cost them their lives. Monday morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching her mood perfectly. The van was back, this time parked on her own street, just 4 houses down. Bold, almost taunting. Sarah watched from her window as normal neighborhood life continued around the threat nobody else could see. Children walked to school with backpacks bouncing. Parents rushed to cars with coffee mugs and briefcases. Henderson waved from her garden. Everything looked exactly as it should, which made the presence of the van feel even more ominous. Sarah made one final attempt at official channels. calling the FBI's local field office. After being transferred 3 times, she reached an agent who listened to her concerns with professional politeness before explaining that vague suspicions didn't constitute actionable intelligence. "Ma'am, if you observe any specific illegal activity, please contact local law enforcement immediately." But surveillance, even if it seems unusual to you, isn't necessarily criminal behavior. "Agent Morrison, I'm telling you there's going to be an attack tomorrow morning. People are going to die." "Based on what specific evidence, ma'am?" Sarah stared out her window at the van, at her neighbors going about their lives, at the normal suburban scene that felt anything but normal to her trained senses. "Based on 8 years of experience keeping people alive." "I understand, ma'am, but experience isn't evidence. If you have photographs, recordings, specific threats, anything concrete, we'd be very interested to review it." After she hung up, Sarah realized she was on her own. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever she'd heard and seen and felt, she would have to handle it alone. Her neighbors didn't believe her. The authorities wouldn't help her, and time was running out. She spent Monday evening making final preparations, laying out tactical gear she'd hoped never to use again, checking weapons she'd prayed she'd never need. Because if she was right, if Tuesday morning brought the violence her instincts predicted, Sarah Martinez would have to become a soldier one more time. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same neighbors who dismissed her warnings would be depending on the very skills they'd suggested she needed therapy to overcome. The woman they'd written off as paranoid and damaged would be their only hope of survival. As night fell over Maple Street, Sarah took up position at her front window, watching and waiting. Tomorrow would prove whether she was a vigilant protector or a broken veteran lost in her own delusions. Either way, she'd find out soon enough. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd spent the entire night rotating between watch positions throughout her house, monitoring every angle of approach to the neighborhood. Her military training had taught her that the hours before dawn were when most attacks occurred, when targets were sleepy, when response times were slowest, when darkness provided cover for movement. At 3:30 a.m., her vigil was rewarded. The white van returned, but this time it wasn't alone. 2 more vehicles followed at a distance, a dark sedan and another van, this one blue. They positioned themselves at different points around the neighborhood's perimeter, creating what any military tactician would recognize as a containment pattern. Sarah's heart rate elevated, but her mind remained clear and focused. This was it. Whatever she'd stumbled onto was about to happen, and she was the only person in position to respond. She grabbed her tactical vest from the closet, strapping it on over her dark clothing. The weight felt familiar, comforting in a way that civilian clothes never had. Her service pistol went into its holster, extra magazines into the vest pouches. She clipped a tactical flashlight to her belt and grabbed her emergency radio, a habit from her SEAL days that she'd never broken. The radio was programmed with local emergency frequencies, something that might prove crucial if phone networks went down. At 3:45 a.m., she saw movement from the first van. 3 figures emerged, dressed in dark clothing and moving with military precision. Even from her window, Sarah could see they were carrying equipment, backpacks that looked heavy, and what appeared to be some kind of cylinders. Her blood chilled as she recognized the signature of a coordinated attack. Multiple vehicles for extraction routes, equipment staging, timing that suggested they knew neighborhood patterns. This wasn't random violence or simple terrorism. This was a professional operation. Sarah keyed her emergency radio to the police frequency and spoke quietly but clearly. "This is Sarah Martinez at 847 Maple Street. We have multiple suspicious vehicles and armed individuals staging what appears to be a coordinated attack in the Oakwood subdivision. Request immediate backup." The radio crackled with static, then a dispatcher's voice. "Ma'am, please use 911 for emergency calls. This frequency is reserved for official personnel. I am former Navy SEAL reporting active threat development. Multiple vehicles, multiple suspects carrying what appears to be explosive devices." A different voice came on the radio. Gruffer, more authoritative. "This is Sergeant Williams. Ma'am, we've got your address flagged for previous false reports. Are you having another episode?" Sarah bit back her frustration. Even now, with the threat developing in real time, her credibility was undermined by past mistakes. "Sergeant, I am watching 3 armed individuals remove equipment from vehicles positioned around our neighborhood. This is not an episode. Ma'am, officers are en route to your location for a wellness check. Sarah almost threw the radio across the room. A wellness check. They were sending officers to evaluate her mental state while terrorists prepared to murder her neighbors. The same neighbors who'd laughed at her warnings were sleeping peacefully while death crept toward their doors. At 3:47 a.m., the choice was taken from her. The explosion ripped through the morning silence like the end of the world. Sarah's windows rattled in their frames as a massive fireball erupted from the Johnson house 3 blocks away. The sound was devastating, a deep concussive blast that seemed to shake the earth itself. Car alarms began screaming throughout the neighborhood. House lights flickered on as residents woke to chaos. Dogs started barking frantically. And somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear human screams beginning to rise above the mechanical noise. She was already moving before the sound faded, grabbing her keys and racing for her back door. The tactical part of her mind was cataloging information even as she ran. Secondary explosions meant multiple devices. The timing suggested coordination. The location indicated this was just the beginning. Her damaged ankle protested as she vaulted her back fence. But adrenaline overrode the pain. She moved through backyards toward the explosion, staying low and using cover. In the distance, she could see the orange glow of fire painting the sky. The Johnson house was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, completely obliterated. Where a 2-story colonial had stood minutes before, there was now a crater surrounded by burning debris. The houses on either side were damaged, their windows blown out, siding peeled back by the blast. But this wasn't what stopped Sarah cold. What terrified her was the methodical way the attack was continuing. She could see figures moving in the shadows between houses, carrying equipment toward other homes. They weren't running or panicking like the residents beginning to emerge from their houses. They were working, executing a plan with military precision. Sarah spoke into her radio again. Multiple explosions in Oakwood subdivision. The Johnson residence has been destroyed. Suspects are moving toward additional targets. We need bomb disposal and tactical response immediately. This time, the response was different. All units, we have confirmed explosion in Sector 7. First responders en route. Unknown if this is gas leak or intentional act. It's intentional, Sarah transmitted. I have visual on suspects moving with additional devices. She saw Mrs. Henderson stumble out of her house in her nightgown, confused and terrified by the chaos. The elderly woman was looking around frantically, probably trying to understand what had happened to her quiet neighborhood. That's when Sarah spotted one of the attackers approaching Mrs. Savage's Henderson's house from the blind side, carrying what looked like another cylindrical device. The man was moving deliberately, professionally, taking advantage of the confusion to position his next target. Sarah didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the street, ignoring the pain shooting through her ankle with each step. The attacker was focused on placing his device, and didn't see her coming until she tackled him from behind. They hit the ground hard, rolling across Mrs. Henderson's perfectly manicured lawn. The man was trained. Sarah could tell immediately from how he moved, how he tried to counter her attack. But Sarah had 8 years of the most intensive combat training in the world, and fury was driving her now. The fight was brutal but brief. The attacker tried to reach for a pistol in his waistband, but Sarah broke his wrist with a precise strike before he could draw. When he attempted to call out to his partners, she silenced him with a chokehold that left him unconscious in seconds. "Mrs. Henderson!" Sarah called out as she zip-tied the attacker's hands behind his back with restraints from her vest. "Get back inside. Lock your doors." The older woman stared at Sarah in shock, taking in the tactical vest, the weapons, the unconscious man on her lawn. "Sarah, what's happening? We're under attack. Get inside, stay low, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Sarah grabbed the cylindrical device the attacker had been carrying. It was definitely a bomb, professionally made, with a timer that showed 12 minutes remaining. She'd seen similar devices during her deployments and knew exactly how deadly they could be. Her radio crackled. "All units, we have reports of additional explosions and gunfire in the Oakwood subdivision. SWAT and bomb disposal are 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. Sarah looked at the timer on the device in her hands, 11 minutes and counting, and knew that was 20 minutes too long. She keyed her radio. "This is Martinez. I have captured one suspect and recovered an explosive device with an 11-minute timer. There are additional attackers in the area with more devices. Ma'am, do not approach any suspicious devices. Wait for bomb disposal. Negative. People are going to die if these devices aren't stopped. I'm going after the other attackers. Sarah disabled the bomb using techniques she'd learned in a classified course she technically wasn't supposed to remember. It took her 90 seconds, time she didn't have to spare, but couldn't afford not to take. As she worked, she could hear more chaos erupting around the neighborhood. Gunshots echoed between the houses, suggesting the other attackers were encountering resistance or had been spotted by residents. Car engines roared as some neighbors tried to flee, while others were trapped by debris from the first explosion. The bomb disabled, Sarah moved toward the sounds of combat. Her ankle was screaming now, but she pushed the pain aside. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd trained for her entire military career: asymmetric warfare in an urban environment, protecting civilians from coordinated attack. She found the second attacker near the Chen house, where Tom lived with his 6-year-old daughter Emma. The man was trying to place another device while Tom stood in his doorway, apparently trying to reason with someone he thought was a utility worker or emergency responder. "Tom, get back inside," Sarah shouted as she approached from behind cover. The attacker spun toward her voice, drawing a pistol with professional speed. But Sarah was already moving, using a parked car for cover as bullets sparked off metal around her. This one was definitely military trained. His positioning was perfect, his fire controlled and accurate. Sarah flanked him through the neighbor's yard, moving in a pattern she'd used in Iraq and Afghanistan. The muscle memory was still there, even after 2 years of civilian life. Her body knew how to flow from cover to cover, how to minimize exposure while maintaining offensive capability. When she had a clear shot, she took it. Her bullet caught the attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. She was on him before he could recover, kicking his weapon away and securing him with another zip tie. "Tom," she called out. "Are you and Emma safe?" Tom Chen emerged from his house, his face pale with shock. His daughter clung to his leg, crying softly. "Sarah? What's happening? Who are these people?" "Terrorists. They're trying to destroy the neighborhood. I need you to take Emma and get to the community center. It's the farthest point from here and has good sight lines. Can you do that?" Tom nodded, his software engineer's mind apparently processing the logic of her instructions even through his fear. "What about you? There's at least one more attacker out there. Maybe 2. I need to stop them before they can set off more bombs." Sarah checked the second device. This one had been set for 15 minutes, giving her a bit more time to work with. As she disabled it using the same techniques, she could hear sirens in the distance. Finally, official help was coming, but she still needed to locate the remaining attackers. Her radio crackled. "All units, we have multiple civilian reports of a female in tactical gear engaging suspects. Can we get confirmation on the identity of this individual?" Sarah keyed her radio. "This is Martinez. I've neutralized 2 attackers and disabled 2 explosive devices. Searching for remaining suspects." "Ma'am, you need to cease operations immediately and wait for tactical units." "Negative. People are still in danger." She moved toward the third vehicle she'd observed, the blue van that had positioned itself near the neighborhood's eastern entrance. If the attackers were following standard protocol, they'd have established an extraction route and positioned someone to provide overwatch during the operation. As she approached, staying in shadows and moving carefully despite her injury, she could see the van's interior was lit by the glow of electronic equipment. Someone was inside, probably coordinating the attack or monitoring police communications. Sarah circled around behind the van, using abandoned cars and debris from the explosion as cover. The back doors were slightly open, and she could hear voices inside speaking in the same accented English she'd overheard days before. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 delayed. Police response faster than anticipated. Continue with remaining targets. Extraction in 10 minutes. Sarah realized they weren't just trying to destroy random houses. This was a coordinated attack with multiple phases, suggesting a larger plan. The Johnson house had been Phase 1 probably chosen because it was isolated and would create maximum chaos, but there were more targets, more bombs, More death planned for her neighbors. She keyed her radio one more time. "Command, this is Martinez. I'm at the eastern extraction point. Suspects have additional phases planned. They're not finished." The response came from a different voice, probably someone more senior. "Martinez, this is Lieutenant Brooks. What's your military background?" "Former Navy SEAL, 8 years active duty, combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan." A pause. "Martinez, tactical units are 3 minutes out. Can you maintain overwatch on that position without engaging?" Sarah looked at the van, thinking about the conversation she'd just overheard, about the remaining phases they'd mentioned, about her neighbors still sleeping in houses that might be targeted. "Negative, Lieutenant. They're planning additional attacks. I need to stop them now." "Martinez, wait for backup." But Sarah was already moving. She'd waited for backup before, in places where backup never came or came too late to matter. She'd learned that sometimes you had to act alone, had to take risks others couldn't or wouldn't take, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The van held 3 more attackers and enough explosive material to level half the neighborhood. Sarah had 2 minutes to stop them before they could execute whatever Phase 2 involved. She took a deep breath, checked her ammunition, and prepared to do what she'd been trained to do, what she'd sworn an oath to do, even if that oath had never officially included this quiet suburban street. The woman her neighbors had dismissed as paranoid and damaged was about to show them exactly what 8 years in the world's most elite fighting force had taught her about protecting innocent lives. Sarah approached the van with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through dozens of combat operations. Every step was calculated, every angle of approach considered. The attackers inside were focused on their equipment and coordination, giving her a crucial advantage of surprise. Through the slightly open rear doors, she could see 3 men hunched over electronic devices and what appeared to be a detailed map of the neighborhood. Red circles marked various houses, far more than the 2 that had already been targeted. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the true scope of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a terrorist attack. It was systematic destruction designed to eliminate an entire community. She could hear their conversation more clearly now, and the tactical part of her mind was analyzing every word. "Building 7 in 90 seconds, one voice said. "Building 12 in 3 minutes. "Police response heavier than expected," another replied. "2 units compromised. Execute remaining sequence. We adapt." Sarah realized they were talking about her neighbors' homes, like military targets. Building 7 would be the Martinez place, 2 streets over, a family with 3 young children. Building 12 was the retirement community where dozens of elderly residents lived independently. The timer on one of their remaining devices showed 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Even if SWAT arrived immediately, they wouldn't have time to evacuate everyone or disable all the explosives. Sarah was looking at a mass casualty event that would make national news, turn her quiet neighborhood into a memorial site. She keyed her radio one final time, speaking barely above a whisper. "Lieutenant Brooks, they have devices targeting multiple residential buildings with civilians inside. I'm seeing timers under 3 minutes. I cannot wait for backup. Martinez, do not engage." "That's an order." "With respect, Lieutenant, you're not my commanding officer, and people are about to die." Sarah switched off the radio. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing weren't the same thing, and she'd made her choice the moment she'd put on the tactical vest. The attack had to be swift and decisive. 3 trained operatives in a confined space with explosive devices that could kill her instantly if damaged. Sarah had handled worse odds in Fallujah, but never with so many innocent lives hanging in the balance. She moved to the front of the van first, using her tactical knife to puncture 2 tires. Even if one of them tried to drive away, they wouldn't get far. Then she positioned herself at the rear doors, weapon ready, mind clear. The element of surprise lasted exactly 4 seconds. Sarah yanked the doors open and put 2 rounds into the chest of the nearest attacker before he could react. The second man tried to reach for a weapon, but Sarah was already inside the van, moving with the fluid violence of her training. Her elbow caught him in the throat, crushing his windpipe and dropping him instantly. The third attacker was better trained or more experienced. Instead of reaching for a gun, He lunged for one of the explosive devices, clearly intending to detonate it manually and take everyone with him. Sarah tackled him before he could reach the trigger mechanism, and they crashed into the electronic equipment. The fight inside the cramped van was brutal. The attacker was strong, well-trained, and desperate. He fought with the fury of someone who knew capture meant failure of his mission. Sarah fought with the cold precision of someone who'd learned to kill professionally, efficiently, without emotion clouding her judgment. When her opponent tried to gouge her eyes, Sarah broke his arm. When he attempted to bite her throat, she used his momentum to slam his head into the van's metal wall. The fight ended when Sarah applied a chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain, rendering him unconscious in seconds. Breathing hard, Sarah surveyed the interior of the van. Electronic equipment hummed around her, displays showing countdown timers for devices throughout the neighborhood. She counted 7 more targets, including the retirement community, and 2 schools that wouldn't open for hours, but housed maintenance staff and early programs. The nearest timer showed 1 minute and 47 seconds. Sarah's demolitions training kicked in as she examined the devices. They were sophisticated, professionally made, with anti-tamper mechanisms that would detonate them if she tried to disable them incorrectly. But they all shared the same basic design, which meant the same technique should work on all of them. She started with the device targeting Building 7, working with steady hands despite the countdown. Military training had taught her to compartmentalize, to focus entirely on the task at hand while blocking out distractions like time pressure or fear of failure. 30 seconds. 20. 10. The timer stopped with 4 seconds remaining. Sarah immediately moved to the next device, this one targeting the retirement community. The mechanism was identical, but her hands were shaking slightly now from adrenaline and the knowledge of how close she'd just come to failure. She could hear sirens getting closer, voices shouting in the distance, the chaos of emergency response finally catching up to the reality of the attack. But Sarah blocked it all out, focusing entirely on the delicate work of preventing mass murder. The second device disabled, she moved to the third. This one was different, more sophisticated, with additional wiring that suggested a backup detonation system. Sarah studied it for precious seconds, calling up everything she'd learned in classified training courses about improvised explosive devices. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Through the van's windshield, she could see tactical officers approaching with weapons drawn. Finally, backup had arrived, but they were treating her as a potential threat. "Drop your weapons! Hands where I can see them." Sarah keyed the emergency frequency on the radio one of the attackers had been using. "This is Martinez inside the van. I have multiple explosive devices with active timers. I need 90 more seconds to disable them. Ma'am, exit the vehicle immediately." "Negative. People will die if I don't finish this." She went back to work on the third device, trying to trace the backup system while maintaining pressure on the primary disarming mechanism. Her ankle was throbbing, her hands were cramping from the precise work, and she could feel exhaustion starting to creep in at the edges of her consciousness. But the device clicked off with 17 seconds to spare. 4 devices neutralized, she transmitted. 3 more active. Outside the van, she could hear heated radio conversations between the tactical team and their commanding officers. Someone was arguing about whether to trust her, whether she was actually helping or making things worse. The debate was academic. Sarah was the only person on scene with the training to handle the remaining explosives. Device 4 was targeting a daycare center that wouldn't open for hours but might have staff arriving early. Sarah disabled it with 11 seconds remaining. Device 5, aimed at the fire station, took longer because of additional anti-tamper features, but she managed it with 6 seconds to spare. The final device was the most complex, clearly meant as insurance in case the others failed. It was programmed to detonate in the center of the neighborhood, positioned to cause maximum structural damage to surrounding homes. Sarah realized this was their endgame. If they couldn't achieve precision destruction, they'd settle for general devastation. The timer showed 53 seconds when she started working on it. This device had multiple systems, redundant triggers, and what appeared to be a dead man's switch that would activate if she made a mistake. Sarah had seen similar designs in Iraq, usually protecting high-value targets or critical infrastructure. 20 seconds. Sarah's training took over completely, her conscious mind stepping aside to let muscle memory and ingrained knowledge guide her hands. She'd disarmed devices like this before, in places where failure meant not just her death, but the death of her entire team. 10 seconds. The mechanism was fighting her, springs and wires trying to complete circuits that would send electrical current to the detonator. Sarah's fingers worked with surgical precision, finding the exact pressure points that would prevent connection without triggering backup systems. 5 seconds. The timer stopped at 2 seconds remaining. Sarah slumped back against the van's wall, every ounce of adrenaline draining from her system at once. 7 explosive devices disabled. 3 attackers neutralized. An entire neighborhood saved from systematic destruction. All devices neutralized. She transmitted on the emergency frequency. Threat contained. The tactical officers approached the van more cautiously now, their weapons lowered, but ready. Sarah slowly placed her pistol on the floor and raised her hands, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether she was treated as a hero or a vigilante. "I'm coming out," she called. Former Navy SEAL, 8 years active duty. "I've neutralized all hostile forces and disabled all explosive devices." Lieutenant Brooks was the first to reach the van, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. "Martinez? What the hell just happened here?" Sarah limped out of the van, her damaged ankle finally giving way after hours of stress and combat. "Coordinated terrorist attack, sir. Multiple phases. Professional execution. Enough explosives to level half the neighborhood." Brooks looked inside the van, taking in the sophisticated equipment, the disabled bombs, the 3 unconscious or dead attackers. How many civilians would have died if you hadn't intervened? Sarah did quick mental calculations based on what she'd observed. Minimum 50, probably closer to 100 if they'd hit the retirement community during breakfast. The schools would have been empty, but staff could have been killed. "And you handled this alone?" "I tried to get help, sir." Multiple calls to police, FBI, emergency services. Nobody believed me. Age double bag. And so went to the cavalry room, staring up at some point as if 2 officials disappeared. This is the book, it's about history." Sarah leaned against a nearby car, exhausting finally catching up to her. "I'm sorry I disobeyed your order to wait for backup, but there wasn't time." Brooks studied her for a long moment, then keyed his radio. "Command, this is Brooks. The situation is contained. We have 1 very effective civilian who prevented a major terrorist attack. I'm recommending immediate medical attention and a full debrief." As paramedics approached to check her ankle and treat minor cuts from the fighting, Sarah could see her neighbors emerging from their houses. The same people who dismissed her warnings were staring at her with mixtures of shock, gratitude, and something that might have been shame. Mrs. Henderson was the first to approach, still in her nightgown but no longer looking confused or helpless. "Sarah, dear, I owe you an apology." "No, ma'am, you don't. You couldn't have known." Tom Chen appeared with his daughter Emma clinging to his hand. The 6-year-old looked up at Sarah with wide eyes, taking in the tactical vest, the weapons, the obvious signs of combat. "Are you a superhero?" Emma asked seriously. Sarah managed a tired smile. "No, sweetheart. I'm just a neighbor who used to be a soldier," Sarah said, looking at Emma's father. "I'm sorry I scared you when I tried to warn you. I know it sounded crazy." Tom shook his head. "Sarah, you saved our lives. Emma's life. I should have listened to you." He paused, looking around at the destruction and emergency vehicles. "How did you know?" "Training, experience, and instincts that civilian life never quite manages to turn off," Sarah replied. "Sometimes the skills that seem like paranoia in suburban life are exactly what's needed when the world goes wrong." More neighbors were gathering now, people Sarah had tried to warn, people who'd suggested she needed therapy or medication to deal with her episodes. They looked at her differently now, seeing not a damaged veteran but the protector she'd always been. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same qualities that had made her seem unstable in civilian life, hypervigilance, tactical thinking, inability to fully relax, were exactly what had saved their lives when it mattered most. As the paramedics worked on her ankle and crime scene investigators processed the van, Sarah realized that her war wasn't over. It had just changed locations, from foreign battlefields to American neighborhoods. The enemy was different, the stakes were different, but the mission remained the same: protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. Lieutenant Brooks approached her as she sat in the ambulance. "Martinez, we're going to need extensive debriefing, but I want you to know, what you did here tonight, it's going to save a lot of lives beyond just this neighborhood." "How so, sir?" These devices, this coordination, the professional level of the operation, this was a test run for something bigger. By stopping it here, you've given us intelligence that might prevent attacks in other cities. Sarah nodded, understanding the broader implications. Terrorists often conducted smaller operations to test techniques and response times before attempting major attacks. Her intervention hadn't just saved her neighbors, it had potentially disrupted a larger network. "Lieutenant, there's something else you should know," Sarah said. This wasn't random. They had detailed maps, specific targeting information, knowledge of neighborhood patterns. Someone provided them with local intelligence. Brooks's expression darkened. "You think they had inside help?" "I think someone spent weeks or months studying this community, learning our routines, identifying optimal targets. That level of reconnaissance requires either extensive surveillance or local assistance." The investigation that followed would eventually prove Sarah right. The attack had been planned for months, with inside information provided by someone with legitimate access to city planning records and emergency response procedures. But that night, as dawn broke over Maple Street, Sarah was simply a soldier who'd done her job. The woman her neighbors had laughed at, the veteran they'd suggested needed counseling, had proven that some warnings should never be ignored, and some people never stop being warriors, even when the battle comes to their own front door. 3 days after the attack, Sarah sat in a sterile FBI conference room, her ankle in a walking boot, facing a panel of investigators from multiple agencies. The room was filled with the quiet intensity of people trying to piece together how a suburban neighborhood had become the target of sophisticated terrorism. Agent Morrison, who had dismissed her initial call, sat directly across from her, his expression a mixture of professional respect and personal embarrassment. To his left was Director Janet Walsh from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, a stern woman with silver hair who'd flown in from Washington specifically for this case. "Miss Martinez," Director Walsh began, "let's start with your initial observations. What first made you suspicious?" Sarah had told this story dozens of times over the past 3 days, but she recounted it again with military precision. The surveillance patterns, the vehicle rotations, the overheard conversation fragments. Details that had seemed paranoid to everyone else but had painted a clear picture of operational planning to her trained eye. "In your professional opinion," Agent Morrison interjected, "how long would this operation have taken to plan?" "Minimum 6 months, probably longer," Sarah replied without hesitation. They had detailed neighborhood layouts, residence schedules, emergency response timelines. That level of intelligence requires extensive surveillance or inside access to information. Director Walsh leaned forward. "Explain what you mean by inside access." Sarah had been thinking about this constantly since the attack. "Sir, they knew which houses would cause maximum psychological impact when destroyed. They knew emergency response times. They knew which residents were likely to be home during different shifts. That's not information you get from casual observation." The room fell silent as the implications settled over the investigators. A domestic terrorism cell was frightening enough, but one with access to official planning documents or law enforcement information represented a much more serious threat. "We've been analyzing the devices you disabled," said Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the FBI's chief explosives expert who joined the briefing via video conference. "The sophistication level is consistent with state-sponsored terrorism or highly trained international networks. These weren't improvised bombs made from internet instructions." Sarah nodded. "The attackers moved like military personnel. Coordinated timing, professional equipment, tactical communication protocols. This was a sponsored operation." Director Walsh consulted her notes. "Ms. Martinez, during your SEAL service, did you encounter similar operational patterns?" "Yes, ma'am." Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Usually backed by Iranian or Russian intelligence, sometimes ISIS or Al-Qaeda affiliates. But the target selection here is different. How so? Sarah chose her words carefully. Overseas, attacks like this target military installations, government buildings, infrastructure, high-value strategic targets. This attack targeted a random suburban neighborhood. That suggests either a psychological warfare objective, or this community was chosen for specific reasons we haven't identified yet. Agent Morrison pulled up a digital map on the conference room screen. "We've been analyzing the target pattern. The houses they selected don't seem random when you look at the residents. Red dots mark the locations of the planned explosions across a satellite image of the neighborhood. Sarah studied the pattern, her tactical mind immediately recognizing the logic. It's not about the houses, she realized. It's about the people. Director Walsh waited for her to continue. Look at the target selection. The Johnson house belonged to a retired Army colonel. Tom Chen works for a defense contractor developing encryption software. The Martinez family. Not me. The other Martinez is David Martinez, is a federal prosecutor specializing in terrorism cases. Sarah pointed to more locations on the map. The retirement community houses 3 former CIA officers, 2 retired FBI agents, and a former NSA analyst. This wasn't random terrorism. This was systematic elimination of people with national security connections. The room fell silent as the full scope of the attack became clear. This hadn't been about creating general fear or chaos. Someone had identified a concentration of current and former national security personnel and their families, then planned to eliminate them in a way that would look like random suburban terrorism. Miss Martinez? Director Walsh said quietly. How many people in your neighborhood have security clearances or intelligence backgrounds? Sarah had been wondering about this herself. More than should be coincidental, ma'am. When I moved here 2 years ago, I thought it was just a nice, quiet neighborhood. But thinking back on conversations, yard sales, casual mentions of where people used to work, we've got an unusual concentration of people with military, intelligence, or federal law enforcement backgrounds. Agent Morrison was typing rapidly on his laptop. We're running background checks on all residents now. If you're right about this being targeted assassination disguised as terrorism, the selection of this specific neighborhood becomes crucial intelligence. Dr. Reeves's voice came through the video conference speaker. Ms. Martinez, the timer mechanisms on the devices were synchronized to create a specific sequence. Can you walk us through what would have happened if you hadn't intervened? Sarah had reconstructed the timeline multiple times in her mind, always reaching the same horrifying conclusion. The Johnson house explosion was designed to create chaos and draw emergency response. While police and fire departments focused on that location, the other devices would have detonated in sequence, trapping first responders and preventing effective evacuation or medical aid. She pointed to locations on the map. The retirement community would have been hit during breakfast, when most residents were in the dining hall. Maximum casualties in a confined space. The Chen house and others would have eliminated specific individuals while making it look like random collateral damage. Body count estimate? Director Walsh asked bluntly. Conservative estimate. Assuming emergency services responded perfectly, 60 dead, maybe 100 injured. Realistic estimate, accounting for trapped first responders and failed evacuations, over 200 casualties. The numbers hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah had prevented the worst domestic terrorist attack since 9/11, stopped in a suburban neighborhood most Americans had never heard of. Agent Morrison cleared his throat. Miss Martinez, we need to discuss the surveillance you conducted on the attackers. Technically, what you did could be considered illegal reconnaissance of American citizens. Sarah had been expecting this. Agent Morrison, I observed suspicious activity from public locations and my own property. I didn't enter private property or conduct electronic surveillance. Everything I did was within the bounds of civilian observation. Even the nighttime reconnaissance when you overheard their conversation? I was on public property, specifically under a vehicle parked on a public street. What I overheard was people speaking loud enough to be heard from a public location. Director Walsh waved off the legal discussion. Agent Morrison, Ms. Saxport, Martinez's methods are irrelevant given the outcome. We're not prosecuting the person who saved 200 lives. The director turned back to Sarah. What we need to understand is how this network identified your neighborhood as a target. Someone provided them with detailed intelligence about residents, schedules, response times. We need to find that source. Sarah had been thinking about this constantly. Ma'am, whoever provided the intelligence knew things that aren't in public records. Emergency response times, resident work schedules, which houses had security systems, or armed occupants. That suggests access to either law enforcement databases or city planning systems. Or, Agent Morrison added grimly, Someone with legitimate reasons to visit homes in the neighborhood. Utility workers, contractors, real estate agents, census workers. Director Walsh made notes on her tablet. We're going to need your help, Ms. Martinez. You know this community, these people. You might notice connections or patterns that wouldn't be obvious to outside investigators. Sarah nodded, though part of her wanted to retreat to the quiet civilian life she'd been trying to build. But the attack had changed everything. Her neighborhood wasn't safe, her neighbors weren't safe, and she was the only person with both the skills and the local knowledge to help protect them. Director Walsh, there's something else, Sarah said. During the attack, one of the terrorists mentioned adapting to heavier-than-expected police response. That suggests they had intelligence about normal emergency response times and procedures. Meaning? Meaning they expected a specific type and speed of response. When they got something different, probably because I was already calling in reports and engaging them directly, they had to modify their plan. But their intelligence was detailed enough that they knew what normal response should look like. Agent Morrison leaned back in his chair. So we're looking for someone with access to emergency response protocols, resident information, and detailed neighborhood intelligence. Someone who's been in the community long enough to observe patterns and build relationships, Sarah added. This level of intelligence gathering takes time and trust. Director Walsh closed her folder. Martinez, we'd like you to work with us as a consultant on this investigation. Your military background, local knowledge, and demonstrated capability make you invaluable to this case. Sarah had known this was coming. The quiet retirement she'd planned, the simple civilian life she'd tried to build, was over. The war had followed her home, and now she was being asked to fight it in her own neighborhood. What would that involve, ma'am? Helping us identify potential sources of intelligence leakage. Observing neighborhood patterns we might miss. Providing tactical analysis of any future threats. Director Walsh paused. And training local law enforcement in counter-surveillance techniques because this probably isn't over. You think they'll try again? Miss Martinez, you disrupted a major operation and captured valuable intel. The network behind this attack now knows their operational security was compromised, and their targets are defended. They'll either abandon this area entirely or escalate significantly. Sarah thought about her neighbors, people who'd laughed at her warnings but who'd also welcomed her into their community. People like Mrs. Henderson, who brought her cookies, Tom Chen, who'd helped her fix her fence, families with children who played in yards that had almost become craters. I'll do it, she said, but I have conditions. Director Walsh raised an eyebrow, such as full disclosure to my neighbors about the nature of the threat. No cover stories, no vague warnings. These people have a right to know they were targeted for assassination and why. That could cause panic, property value crashes, mass evacuation, or it could save their lives if there's another attack. Director, these people trusted me enough to dismiss my warnings because they thought I was mentally unstable. They deserve the truth about why they were almost murdered in their sleep. Agent Morrison looked uncomfortable. Ms. Martinez, that kind of disclosure could compromise the ongoing investigation. Then brief them on what they need to know to stay safe while protecting operational security. But don't lie to them. They've been through enough. Director Walsh considered this. What else? I want authority to coordinate with local law enforcement without going through federal bureaucracy. If I spot another threat, I need to be able to act immediately. Ms. Martinez, you're not law enforcement. We can't give you arrest authority or sanction vigilante operations. Sarah met her eyes steadily. Director, 3 days ago I wasn't law enforcement either, but I'm the only reason this room isn't planning memorial services instead of investigations. I'm not asking for a badge. I'm asking for the ability to protect my community without having to fight through channels that don't understand the threat. The silence stretched for long moments before Director Walsh nodded slowly. We'll work something out. Local law enforcement will be briefed on your role and given authority to coordinate with you during threat situations. Sarah stood to leave, her ankle still aching but her mind already turning to the work ahead. When do we start? Ms. Martinez, Director Walsh called as she reached the door. What you did 3 nights ago. Stopping that attack single-handedly. It's going to change how we think about domestic terrorism response. How so, ma'am? Because you proved that sometimes the best defense against professional terrorists isn't more professionals. Sometimes it's one trained individual who knows the terrain, understands the community, and refuses to let evil succeed. Sarah limped out of the federal building into the Washington afternoon, knowing that her war was far from over. The attack on Maple Street had been prevented, but the network behind it was still out there, still planning, still targeting the people she'd sworn to protect. The woman her neighbors had dismissed as paranoid was now their official protector, tasked with defending them against enemies they'd never imagined and threats they'd never seen coming. And for the first time since her medical discharge, Sarah Martinez felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months after the attack, Sarah Martinez stood in her backyard, watching her neighbors gather for the first annual Maple Street Community Safety Fair. What had started as a federal briefing requirement had evolved into something none of them had expected, a genuine community prepared to defend itself. Mrs. Henderson approached carrying a pitcher of lemonade, her steps more confident than they'd been since the attack. The elderly woman had surprised everyone by being the first to volunteer for the citizen awareness training Sarah had developed with FBI assistance. "Sarah, dear, the fire department says they're ready for the emergency response demonstration whenever you are." Sarah nodded, checking her watch. The fair was running smoothly, with stations teaching everything from basic surveillance detection to emergency medical response. What had begun as a federal mandate to brief residents about the terrorist threat had transformed into comprehensive community preparedness training. "Mrs. Henderson, how's your observation journal coming along?" The older woman smiled proudly. 17 suspicious vehicles logged this month, though most turned out to be legitimate. But I did catch that insurance fraud investigator who was photographing the Morrison house without permission. Sarah had taught all the residents to maintain observation logs, documenting unusual activity in their neighborhood. It served dual purposes, keeping the community alert to potential threats, while giving people a sense of active participation in their own security. Tom Chen jogged over from the communications station, where he'd been demonstrating the neighborhood emergency radio network he'd designed. His 6-year-old daughter Emma followed close behind, wearing a junior safety coordinator badge Sarah had made for her. "Sarah, we've got full coverage now," Tom reported. "Every house has emergency radio capability, and the backup communication protocols are tested and working." The neighborhood had changed dramatically since the attack. What had been a collection of individual families living separate lives had become a coordinated community with shared responsibility for collective security. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The attack meant to destroy their community had made them stronger than ever before. Lieutenant Brooks arrived as the afternoon demonstrations were beginning, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. His relationship with Sarah had evolved from reluctant cooperation to genuine partnership over the months of investigation. "Martinez," he greeted her. "Any updates from the federal team?" "They arrested 3 more network members in Chicago yesterday," Sarah reported quietly, leading him away from the civilian activities. "Same targeting pattern neighborhoods with concentrations of current and former security personnel." Brooks nodded grimly. The investigation had revealed a domestic terror network far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Sarah's intervention hadn't just prevented one attack. It had disrupted a nationwide campaign targeting American intelligence and law enforcement families. Any indication they're planning to come back here? Sarah had been wondering about this constantly. Intelligence suggests they've moved on to softer targets, places without organized community defense. But I'm not dropping our guard. Good call. The federal task force wants another briefing next week about your community defense model. Apparently, other neighborhoods are asking for similar programs. This was something Sarah was still processing. Her desperate improvisation during a terrorist attack had somehow become a template for community-based security that was being studied by law enforcement agencies across the country. Agent Morrison appeared at her elbow, a development that would have surprised her 6 months ago. The FBI agent who'd initially dismissed her warnings had become one of her strongest advocates within the federal bureaucracy. "Sarah, we need to talk privately," he said. "New development." They moved away from the crowd to Sarah's back porch, where she'd spent so many hours watching for threats that never materialized and preparing for dangers that eventually did. "We've identified the inside source," Morrison said without preamble. Sarah had been waiting for this. "Who?" "City Planning Office clerk named David Brennan. He'd been providing detailed neighborhood information to the terror network for 8 months. including resident background checks he'd run illegally through city databases. Sarah felt a mix of vindication and sadness. She'd known there had to be inside help, but learning it was someone with legitimate access to their community information felt like a betrayal of trust that went beyond terrorism. How much did he give them? Everything. Property records, utility usage patterns, vehicle registrations, even building permit information that told them about security systems and safe rooms. Morrison paused. Sarah. They knew which residents were armed, which houses had children, which families traveled frequently. This was targeted assassination with extraordinary precision. The scope of the intelligence breach was staggering. The terrorists hadn't just planned to kill her neighbors. They'd planned to do it with intimate knowledge of their daily lives, their vulnerabilities, their routines. Agent Morrison, there's something I need to tell you, Sarah said. I think they're still watching us. Morrison's expression sharpened immediately. What makes you say that? Nothing I can prove in court, but my instincts are telling me we're still under observation. Different vehicles, different patterns, but the same professional feel. Like they're studying how we've adapted. This had been bothering Sarah for weeks. Her hypervigilance, which had seemed like paranoia before the attack, now felt justified and necessary. But the same instincts that had saved her neighborhood were warning her that the threat hadn't disappeared. New surveillance teams? Or intelligence gathering for a different kind of operation? Maybe they're studying our defenses to develop countermeasures for use against other communities. Morrison made notes on his phone. I'll have technical surveillance run a sweep of the area. If there's ongoing observation, we need to know about it. As the afternoon wound down and neighbors began cleaning up from the safety fair, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who'd once questioned her mental state, but now sought her guidance on everything from home security to emergency preparedness. The transformation was remarkable. Tom Chen had become the neighborhood's communications coordinator. Mrs. Henderson ran the civilian observation network. The retired military personnel had formed an informal advisory council that met weekly to assess potential threats. Emma Chen bounded up to Sarah, still wearing her junior coordinator badge. Miss Sarah, when I grow up, can I be a protector like you? The question caught Sarah off guard. She knelt to Emma's eye level, thinking carefully about how to answer. Emma, the best protectors are people who care about their community and pay attention to what's happening around them. You're already doing both of those things, but I mean like stopping bad guys and saving people. Sarah glanced at Tom, who was watching the conversation with interest. Emma, the most important part of what I do isn't fighting bad guys. It's making sure everyone in our neighborhood looks out for each other. That's something you can do right now. The 6-year-old nodded solemnly, as if receiving an important mission briefing. As evening settled over Maple Street, Sarah conducted her final security sweep of the day, a routine she'd developed that involved checking all the observation points, testing communication systems, and evaluating any changes in the neighborhood's security posture. The street looked peaceful, almost idyllic in the golden hour light. Children played in yards watched over by parents who were more alert than they'd ever been before. Residents chatted over fences, sharing information and maintaining the social connections that had become their first line of defense. But Sarah's trained eye caught details others might miss. The same rental car had appeared in different locations 3 times over the past week. A utility truck had been parked on the perimeter road for longer than any legitimate work would require. Small things, possibly innocent, but forming a pattern that made her tactical instincts tingle. Her secure phone buzzed with a text from Director Walsh. Brennan's arrest led to 4 more suspects. Network bigger than estimated. Stay alert. Sarah responded. Already am. Think we're still under observation. Federal protective detail available if needed. Sarah looked around at her neighborhood, at Mrs. Henderson tending her garden, at Tom helping Emma practice emergency radio procedures, at the dozen other families who'd become her extended responsibility. The offer of federal protection was tempting, but it would also change everything they'd built. Negative. Community defense is working. We'll advise if situation changes. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table cleaning her service pistol, a ritual she'd returned to after the attack. The weapon she'd hoped never to need again had become a daily part of her life, but she no longer resented its necessity. Her laptop displayed the latest intelligence briefing about the ongoing investigation. The network they'd disrupted was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected, with cells in 12 major cities targeting current and former intelligence personnel. But Sarah's neighborhood had become something unexpected in the counterterrorism world, a successful example of community-based defense that had not only prevented attack, but had fundamentally changed how residents thought about security and mutual protection. Her phone rang, displaying Mrs. Henderson's number. "Sarah, dear, I'm sorry to call so late, but there's a van parked at the end of Elm Street, with someone inside using what looks like camera equipment." Sarah was already reaching for her tactical vest. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to stay inside and away from windows. I'm going to investigate. Should I call the police?" "Already on it. Mrs. Henderson, remember your emergency procedures? Lock doors, stay low, radio check-in every 15 minutes until all clear." "Perfect. I'll be back to you within the hour." Sarah suited up and moved into the night, her ankle protesting but no longer limiting her mobility. The neighborhood she'd fought to protect 6 months ago now depended on her daily vigilance, and she'd accepted that responsibility completely. As she approached the suspicious vehicle, using the same tactical movement techniques that had served her during the original attack, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed in her life. She was no longer a former soldier trying to adjust to civilian life. She was a guardian protecting a community that had become her mission and her family. The woman her neighbors had once dismissed as paranoid had become their shield against a world more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. And for the first time since her military discharge, Sarah Martinez felt completely at peace with who she was and what she was meant to do. The van's engine started as she approached, suggesting the occupants had spotted her or were operating on a predetermined schedule. Sarah memorized the license plate as it pulled away, already planning her report to federal authorities. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from Director Walsh. "Intelligence indicates possible escalation planning. Network may be shifting to different tactics." Sarah responded while walking back toward her house. "Neighborhood ready for whatever comes. We don't surrender what we've built." As she conducted her final security check of the evening, Sarah looked at the houses around her, homes where families slept safely because of the defenses they'd built together, the watchfulness they'd learned to maintain, and the community bonds that had made them stronger than any terrorist network. The attack that was supposed to destroy them had instead created something unprecedented, a civilian community capable of defending itself, bound together by shared purpose and mutual protection. Sarah Martinez, the guardian of Maple Street, settled into her watch position and prepared for whatever the night might bring. Her war was far from over, but she was exactly where she belonged, standing between the people she'd sworn to protect and anyone who would do them harm. The woman they'd laughed at had become the shield they couldn't live without. They laughed at her warning, until the seal in her took control.